Hello, everyone, and welcome to New York College Mental Health Podcast. This is our third episode, and I'm so excited about the topic that today's topic, and we're going to talk about self. But before the topic, I want to introduce our guest. Recently, I had the privilege of joining her class, talking about trauma, and we had so much fun that we were intrigued, and I invited her to talk about self today. Xristina has an undergraduate degree in philosophy, education, and psychology. And she has a postgraduate diploma on MSc on counseling psychology. She's been doing some research. And at the moment, she's also receiving her training on systemic narrative therapy. At the same time,
Yes.
the
And
Xristina,
collaborative and appreciative inquiry as well. Yeah.
yes. And also, Xristina is a teacher at New York College, Athens. Uh, she's quite light and she knows what she's doing. When we were talking about this today's topic, she gave me her thoughts about what she could talk. I think we could just have a season of podcasts just with the every single thing that she
Yes,
gave to me. I'm so excited.
I think
By
so
the way,
too.
by the way, Kristen also works with children and adolescents and their families, especially special educational needs, providing counseling and therapy. And is there anything that you wanted to say, you wanted to talk about that I missed here, Christina?
I think you've covered everything, Denise. Thank you for having me here. It's such an honor and a joy to join this wonderful, initiative. Um, Yes, as I was, laying out the appendix of our today's discussion, I thought so too. These are, different, entirely different, topics for entirely different podcasts. But, we'll just try to, tiptoe around them. Yeah, some basic concepts. Yeah.
We have a fascinating topic, which is self.
Mm-hmm.
And, one might think self doesn't sound reliable or not reliable, relatable with the concept of mental health. Maybe it's a psychological theory about a concept, but I
Yes.
think it might be something more. Can you help us define this? What is self?
That's a good question. That sounds a very simple question, but it's not, right? So every psychological trait theory of personality trait theory of the past, I think they were trying to pinpoint a map of personality, of consciousness, and it's perfectly fine, right? But I think we are currently going off the trails, off this map, with the postmodern theories, when the sense of self is reconstructed. It's deconstructed all the time and reconstructed. So modern approaches, what do
Mhm.
they say? What do they really say? That there is a self in relation. So it's a very, it's a fluid process. There's no a concrete sense of self. I can see a hint of a question there. Um, so it's the social constructionism and constructivism that says basically that we reconstruct every moment, our selfhood. Every moment, every given moment, okay, it's a co-construction of every person that we meet. So they basically say that we have different, selves or personal, manifestations of self. Uh, yes.
The way that I see, when I first think about it, the concept, I was like,
Mhm.
what do you mean? There's I. I am the self. And it's constant. It feels constant, maybe.
Of course, yes.
But what you're saying is intriguing because you're saying, wait a second, it's not something that is concrete. It's a process. It's everything you accumulate
Yes, exactly.
and related to the world.
It's like what Bakhtin says, that we see ourselves through the eyes of the others, right? So
Hmm.
one sense of self is created basically in a social, through the social dimension. So
Oh.
imagine, yes, so imagine children, right? What can they tell about themselves? They can tell everything that has to do with how others perceive them, right? So
Hmm.
again, uh, postmodernism doesn't, question the sense of self in its entirety, but it's questioning the sense of a concrete self. So
Hmm.
basically, we have some elements, of course, that is the core self, okay, that is the basic elements of our existence. That's our spirituality, that it's our core beliefs, of course, in discussion to CBT, for example. But postmodernism basically says that we can uh, change everything in the process, that it's not something that we cannot change. I think that's the basic meaning, and it's very hopeful for me. I don't know, that's the first thing that, got me in the first place to dive into these approaches. Um,
It reminded me in the first episode, the Mr. Chakos, I think he was
hmm?
talking about transference. And he was saying that we have an effect on the world and how others see and perceives us.
Exactly.
And is something that we need to focus on. In a way, today you are saying is self is a construct that we built. And the way to understand self goes through the lens of others, if I understand that correct.
Yes, yes, exactly that. So you may, just hearing what you said about transference and counter-transference, right? Basically, when you think about it, we have a lot of different therapeutic selves as well. Us as therapists, we're not the same therapist every single time. You're different with every, client that
Oh,
comes to you, right? So you
yes.
basically meet the core conditions of therapy, like, Rogerian acceptance and unconditional positive regard and empathy. Of course, this is the core, but you basically have a different transference, receive a different transference. So the counter transference is different every time, right? So you
Yes,
may
it
say
is.
that's the professional, that's the embodying therapeutic self, okay, as we say in systemic and narrative approaches. And this can be, in conversation to the professional self.
Hmm.
So basically, whatever is the reaction that we may bring, the counter transfers reaction is going through a lens of professional self. Okay, all the biases, all the multicultural elements. Uh,
Hmm. So, unlike the early psychoanalyst or early approaches to therapy, what you're
mhm.
saying is the self, especially the professional self, we make the therapist become part of that person's life and part of kind of an interpreter, perhaps.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Yes,
So it says, tell me yourself and let me tell you how I see that self.
exactly.
And let's build a relationship around that.
Exactly, and it's collaborative. It's
Yes.
an ongoing process. It's a never-ending discussion, right? So in narrative, for example, you may say, "Okay, I will be the co-author, of your story. So we will rewrite your story. You are the expert. Okay, you are the author. I can be the co-author. I
Mm,
don't know. It's a very this idea of uh, co-authoring is very dear to me because it's a manifestation of writing interest that I have in my personal life. So I think it can be a very it's a new language if I can describe it.
yes.
It's a new map. It's a new, narrative self map. So it's like, every time you can, see yourself as a therapist discovering a new land, a new, civilization. This is the personal uh, climate of the client and their personal frame of reference, for example. So they say in narrative therapy that you can be the witness, of the client's process of change.
The more you talk about it, more my experience comes into this. For example, therapy is different with each and every client of mine, and
Yeah.
it's something entirely transformed. Sometimes we laugh, like half of the session, we laugh, and then
Yes, of course. Of course. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and we make jokes, and
Yes,
making jokes becomes the transformative process. Being able to not take things too seriously, and
exactly.
then looking at from one perspective is good for one person.
Yes,
On the other hand, for another person, there is this space. It's like we don't call,
exactly.
we don't call us. We are so polite. We always call. I've been called Mr. Uyanik, in a way, in a therapy context. But it's change, and
Yes,
it is their self and how they construct manifest. Hmm.
exactly. It's very liberating for me. It was very liberating therapeutically because again, as they say in systemic therapy, you cannot, do the change. You cannot be the change. Okay, the client has to make the change in their lives, of course, but you can, um, distract or disturb, as they say, the
Hmm.
system. Right? It's like a lake. You
Yeah.
can disturb the surface of the water, but you cannot, make any other changes. So the system, for example, the family system is forever changed, okay, in a way from your intervention, but you cannot be the change because therapy is a transforming experience.
Yeah.
It can be therapy. It can be what we say a reparenting experience or a proxy parent experience, but it cannot be a relationship, a reparenting relationship. It's an experience. Okay.
So
Not a therapeutic relationship. It's an entirely different thing. But the transference and the counter transference, it can be, reparenting, but as an experience, not a relationship. Okay.
oh, so it's the by providing the experience within
Mm.
the boundaries of therapeutic relationship,
Mm-hmm.
person experiences, and then their self is transformed because now they have access to those kind of emotions, those kind of responses,
Exactly.
those kind of
Exactly.
needs.
And strengths, right?
Mm. Yeah.
Yes. And I think there comes a newfound resilience, if we can talk about this, or
Mm.
a shared vulnerability, as we discussed about, bringing into the conversation. Shared vulnerability is a concept by Sylvia London and Irma Rodriguez. These are two, I think, Mexican therapists,
Mhm.
family therapists, collaborative. And what they talk about is the shared vulnerability in the therapeutic relationship and in every other relationship. Okay. But especially in the therapeutic relationship is where the therapist can be vulnerable as well. What
Mm.
does that mean? Vulnerable. We have to be authentic.
Mm.
Okay, we are human, so we have the human experience. So one main component is humbleness,
Mm.
and we share the experience of just being human, right?
Mm.
As Jung says, learn the techniques, learn the theories, but in the end, you have to be just a human being opposite another human being. So what they basically say through the shared vulnerability is that this is the childhood of resilience. because there you can find the reciprocity, you can find the recognition, you can find the respect, okay, and be authentic. So authenticity is just being, vulnerable, not in a, in the way that we are used to uh, make use of this word, but in a way of being our authentic selves, if you wish, our true selves. Yeah, you're laughing.
If I tell this to my clients, they would say, no way. Because they would say it's dangerous being
Yes,
vulnerable.
okay. Yes.
Because for most people, being authentic self,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you know, showing and telling what they think, not
Mm-hmm.
creating a self. They're just revealing the self, not in relationship with others, but just whatever they're feeling, whatever they're thinking. It's they feel vulnerable because they feel like they're open to attacks. And if someone shatters that self,
Yeah.
they sometimes a person feels like everything is shattered, everything is broken.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it must be quite hard, I imagine.
Yes, but this is a process, okay? This doesn't happen, from one day to
Yeah.
another. Of course, you have to build the relationship first, the therapeutic relationship, and then, having witnessed it in action, it's quite, in our recent, training, I was quite, on my toes because I was anxious about the therapist. Oh my God, is he out there? Is he revealing stuff?
Mhm.
But it's the self-disclosure that's the relational self-disclosure.
Mm.
Okay, so it's not something, of course, revealing anything from therapist's past. It's something that has to do with the here and now, the therapeutic, reality in the here and now. Um,
Let's go back to self a little bit. You said self is a concept, and although there can be kind of a core self, self evolves and changes all the time.
mhm, mhm,
And you said in a therapeutic context, self is used a lot with the therapist, from therapist self to facilitate change.
mhm,
And you said you use the word lenses.
mhm. Yeah,
But it sounds like there can be more than one self at the same time.
exactly.
How, how does that work?
I think we can, if I may say, if I dare say, we can see, basically the human mind is described as a quantum, computer, right?
Yeah.
Nowadays. So what does that mean? That it can basically, be in a lot of different places at the same time. Okay, so we have different manifestations of selves. This is the multicultural perspective that's been, around since I think, the 80s. They have
Yeah.
started gradually 90s with the development of narrative therapy from White and Epstein and White in Australia and New Zealand. So basically, uh, I think that we can say, can you remind me the first part of the question? Because I have a lot of things, a lot of thoughts coming in.
There are
We have
many.
multiple selves, at the same
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
That's the point. So we have different cultural roles, right? So I can be a mother, I can be a daughter, I can be a sister,
I
a
see.
sibling, a spouse, etc. Okay, this is the, if we can say, the personal self. The professional self may consist of being a student, being a tutor, being a trainee, all of these different aspects. Okay, call for different, personality traits. Okay,
This sounds like there are so many parts of ourselves inside. Who's in charge?
who is in charge? Yes, as they say in internal family systems, right? Who is
Yeah.
leading this polyphony? Yes, exactly. I think what we are asking is the what's the center of consciousness, for example, right? What's
Yeah,
the
it's a deep question though,
yes?
isn't it?
Well, the way I see it is like in narrative we say you have the biographical self, that
Okay.
is the self so far, that's built on experiences or key, main life events, life transitions. So you make a narrative map, okay, to
Hmm.
point all of these, and then you can have the possible selves in the future, right? So it's like having a scenario. You have
Okay.
the build up of the character, okay,
Okay.
but this will actually go is up to you, okay, to decide every single
Hmm.
given moment.
The functions of this polyphonic self or multicultural self, if I
Mhm.
understand it correctly, it's in a way it allows to adapt into situations that we are in.
Exactly, exactly, yeah, exactly. So basically, we say, okay, of course, we don't, the postmodern theories don't, it's a different language. So
Hmm.
let me be clear. We have to speak all the languages, right? So we have to speak the language of the psychodynamic approach, the language of the diagnostic approach, right? We have to speak DSM. We have to speak everything, okay? But it's every time, just think about it this way. Every time you choose the language that you're supposed to speak. So imagine that you're in a different country, okay? You're in France, you won't speak Chinese. It's a very simple example, but I
Hmm.
think this describes it. Okay, so when we work with children and adolescents and their families, we all know the DSM language. We all have the diagnosis. Okay, we all have the documents, but I won't go and ask, a 12-year-old child, okay, what do you think about your perhaps ADHD? Okay,
Hmm.
or whatever. Um, of course, it's part of a psychoeducational process to be able to talk about these things, okay, and again pinpoint them, but it's the different, narrative angle, if we may say. So in narrative therapy, we may approach for example, the ADHD and the possible, difficulties and challenges in everyday life, okay, of the family, is externalizing the problem. So the child is not the problem is the problem, okay. So if you can see it, in a room, okay, where would be the ADHD if it were a person, for example? So you are trying to make them see the problem in relation. This is the relational aspect.
And you
It's
do this by
internalized.
telling as a story.
Pardon?
You do this as turning to life into a narrative story.
Exactly, exactly. So you're the hero of the story. Okay, what part does the ADHD is playing? What would you say to your social anxiety, for example, if you could, have a conversation with them? What's the story of your anxiety?
So the situation doesn't change, but in narrative approach,
Yes,
how person interprets that situation tells because they tell a different story from the same event.
exactly, exactly. And you can invite all the different, narrative voices, because when we do family therapy, we may be, doing co-therapy with the parents or with the sibling. Okay, so
Hmm.
imagine what's going on there. Um, but you can have this polyphony even though you cannot have the actual people in the room, okay, because systemic is always systemic even if you have one person with you. um, yes,
Go on.
Oh, okay, okay. So basically, it's just adding voices, narrative voices. A very, good example is Jakub Seikula. If you're familiar with him, he has established the Hearing Voices Network,
Yes,
and he's studying
the
schizophrenia and yes,
yeah,
psychosis, right?
yeah.
So again, he invites there all the different voices. Okay, it's very, it's revolutionary, but he says, okay, let's hear them out. What do they have to say? Okay, instead of, trying to suppress them and voice them down.
So many things came into mind. There are sport groups.
Mm-hmm.
There's group therapy. I guess it's other people's experiences, sharing with them and writing your narrative story again works. There is dialectical behavior therapy. The
Mm-hmm.
point of it is psychoeducation with people like you staying in a being in a classroom, learning and sharing things in a different way. But you know what I was thinking?
Yeah.
I recently had a chance to spend some time with some old friends. We
Mm-hmm.
sat down, we reminisced, we talk about our high school lives. We were friends
Mm-hmm.
back then. We are still friends, and then we say, and I was telling stories. Oh, it's wonderful! It was the best time of my life.
Yeah.
It's. I wish I could go back to those times. And then I sat down and I realized, no, it was the kind of a worst period of my life. But now, from this perspective that I have written a different narrative story,
Exactly.
and nothing changed. The way that I perceive, that I see changed. My narrative changed.
The point of view change,
Point
right?
of view changed. Yes.
Because I think this is what you're describing is the self reminiscence part. Okay.
Yes.
So in retrospective, everything may be, through the process of memory, it can be something that's an interpretation of our today's self.
Hmm.
So the past is basically part of an interpretation of today's, frame of mind, if you can say that. You see? Yes.
So
So,
go on. Go on, please.
so basically, in narrative therapy, what they say is that you have to bring in balance your past self, your present self, and your future self. So they play with different, the concept of time, the concept of space. It's a very it's very gestalt, if you can say. It's a lot. There's a lot of gestalt, elements. Yeah. And first Gergen has been talking about the self in relation in the 1970s. Kenneth Gergen. We recently met him online. Oh my God, he was like 90 years old. And he was so passionate about speaking about this, talking about these things. And he was such an inspiration, Kenneth Gergen. And in collaborative approach is Harleen Anderson that's been talking about the co-construction is a product of language. She puts language in the equation. How language creates realities. How our language creates our reality.
Hmm. Can you elaborate on that? Let us understand a bit more. You said language. How does
Mm-hmm.
language affect ourselves and our relationship? Perhaps, and if we connect it to what you said earlier, also our own identities.
Exactly. Exactly. So basically, what we are doing in family therapy or parents counseling is 90% of the time changing the language. Not the message, but the language they use, right? So you can say basically you can bring the same message, but in a different way. So I think that in the language you can see transference, encrypted, transference of parents' previous experiences, childhood experiences. Okay, so again, there is a core self that's shaped, of course, in our early stages of development. But I think this self can be in constant collaboration and dialogue with our present self. Okay, so here is a balance, okay, between finding what our inner child has to say, our inner adolescent has to say, in in dialogue with our mature self, okay, adult self. I think transactional analysis is about that. Eric Berne, he's talking
Mhm.
about the parent figure, if it's strict or loving or whatever. Um, so basically, yes, what we do in parents counseling is basically that: change the language. Again, in therapy, we're changing the language. So a lot of times, I find myself, I may bring this professional self and uh, experiential self, embodying self. They are in constant, dialogue in our heads. So you receive a message. There is the transference part, the counter transference, but you have to choose every time whatever is more helpful. Okay, so each time before I speak, I may consider: is this going to be helpful for the client?
Hmm.
Is it within their frame of reference? Is in within their personal dictionary? Because you have to transform the message. If the message is very easy, okay, this it will be dropped out eventually. If it's very difficult, it will not find its way at all. So it has to be suitable in terms of um, how relevant it is to the family system, for example, or how relevant it is to the personal language of the client. I don't know if it's
The example that you gave, you said you have different selves or different, let's say, we can call them whatever that we like. It changes with every approach, but
yes, of course, yes. We
but
create one right now, right?
or lens or self. What
Exactly.
happened was, what happens when two different lenses or two different selves are in conflict with each other? One wants to do something, another one wants to do other.
Exactly. This is the sub-selves, right?
Yeah.
So you may have your essential self. Okay, if you look back to, I think, the wellness model, I don't remember. It's an identity-based model. Okay, so they basically say, okay, the invisible self, okay, you may call it, consists of the essential self, the coping, the social, the creative, the physical. So they have to be aligned. If there is some kind of imbalance between these, concepts, you may find yourself in a state of, emotional, challenge. Um,
Oh, so
mhm,
these crises between different selves also manifests as
mhm.
kind of a modern disorders that we talk about from the language of DSM, like anxiety, it becomes depression, or from
Exactly.
CBT perspective, it becomes the maladaptive worldview.
Behaviors, exactly. And the schemas and the core
Hmm.
beliefs. Yeah, exactly, exactly. Um,
Then
so,
also this could be oneself, which is not aligned, could also corrupt other selves as well, in theory, can it? Because
can it?
if we are talking from a CBT self, I don't know if it's true, but if you're talking about CBT self, schema becomes the main lens or the main self that processes everything. And then there
Yes.
is no place for other lenses, other selves.
Basically that. Yes, exactly. Basically that. Um, And I think it's not irrelevant that, every therapeutic process approach has, encompassed different elements of every other approach. So in schema therapy, you have psychodynamic and CBT. Okay.
Hmm.
Freud was the first systemic
He
therapist, even if
was.
he doesn't, if he wouldn't in any way, admit that. He's talking about in systems, right? His language is regarding systems.
Yeah,
Okay, subconscious, etc.
and then he divided them to three: the ID, the id, the superid, and then
Exactly. Exactly.
ego. And then I think later on psychoanalytic theory turned into, they said the personality is like an onion, and
Mm,
and it's infinite onion, and there are layers, and within each layer there's a different kind of a side of that personality, and we have to tread
exactly.
really carefully to try to open them.
Exactly. So I think basically it's about being, you know, on a spectrum in every way. Okay, because
Mhm.
I think the concept of a spectrum is very relevant to the fluidity of the fluid identities, floating identities that Gergen again has been talking about, floating identities. So if you put in the equation the digital self, right,
Mm.
nowadays, the digital identity. Okay, we have to be in conversation with any different, you know, sense of self. So if I have an adolescent, okay, that's not in any way willing to, you know, speak about his, talk about his family problems or experiences. Okay, he may be expressing himself through his digital identity, right?
Mm.
So you have to find the correct language every time. Um, yeah, so maybe you can, the multicultural approach, I think it was open-minded for me during my master's, the multicultural approach, because for the first time I saw these, you know, if we can say multicultural glasses. I put them on, okay, and never, you know, took them off. The gender roles, the cultural roles, the context. I think it's essential, yeah.
When you were talking about, the first thing came into mind, that there is a public discourse about identities, and postmodernism. There seems to
Mhm,
be some kind of a disagreement. Now, this
mhm,
also kind of infiltrated into language, and this language also created different sides, politically,
mm,
identically, and
yes,
culturally.
yeah.
And as you were saying, everything falls into place. For example, the newer generation, they also change how they express their identity, sexual identity,
Exactly.
and also how they define, which is also a good example of, if we look at it, nothing really changed, but the way that younger generation, the way
Mm-hmm.
that they interpret what's happening with their sexuality, their identity change, and also language change. Now there are different pronouns, they,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
them, we use, and
Exactly.
there are different kind of social acceptance is happening now as
Mm-hmm.
we
A new
understand more.
vocabulary, a new
New
language. Exactly.
vocabulary.
Exactly. And exactly like the digital language, if I
Mm,
may say, as a millennial, we're digital immigrants, for example. Okay, so the generations that are, you know, Gen A, Gen Z, they are natives, digital
mm.
natives. Okay, so they invite us to speak a language. Okay. Um, Yes, again, regarding neurodivergency, again, there's a different, you know, discussion there. Okay, um, so I think it's good for therapists to speak as many languages as they can therapeutically, but every time, just be aware that they are. I think the biggest challenge for a therapist is this multicultural competence, if I may say. This is a multicultural empathy, right?
I was
Regardless
thinking
of
that.
any personal biases, yes, because we carry an essential self, okay, a core self, if you may say. This is our gender, this is our cultural identity, perhaps, this is our spirituality, and then I think I think of the self not as an onion, but as a planet, if you may say. So you have the core, okay, and you have the stuff going on, you know, the climate on the surface, and you're part of a bigger, solar system. So basically, I think that's that. Um, so again, you can work, of course, with the aspects of the social self or the coping self, but in order to reconstruct, essential elements, of course, you have to go deep. You have to go to dive into the past. Okay, we may be in the here and now, and trying to interpret these processes, but you always have to go back. It depends in what way you do it. But I like what White says that we are storytelling animals. So if you see everything, through this lens, um, there's a possibility. Okay, that's like a story; it can change, right, from generation to generation. Because another thing is the intergenerational trauma, for example. Okay, the story I hear from my mother, that she heard from her mother, from my father. Yeah.
On our second episode, I was talking with Marketa and I, we are
Yes.
working with migrants and refugees, asylum seekers, and then we were talking about in a way that pain lingers and it transforms and becomes part of not ourself, perhaps the relationship with other self, with our mothers or with our
Yes.
environment. It also travels through time.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Exactly.
And what you told about therapeutic relationship and our own professional self, and especially it is a challenge for many therapists to become really impartial. Not maybe impartial is not a correct word. I
Multi-partial. Thank you.
multi-partial.
Thank you for that. Multi-partiality was a game-changing concept for me because, sorry for the
Go on, go
interruption.
on, go on, go on.
I always thought, okay, I cannot be neutral. I cannot
Mm.
be, this therapist that, uh, the Freud's era, experiences were demanding. Okay, I cannot be not authentic. I have to be authentic, right?
Mm.
So, do I have the space to do that? Is there a space for me to be authentic, but still be, ethical and present and with unconditional positive regard, etc. So, multi-partiality really did change everything for me because you're not neutral. Okay, neutrality is uh, the, if we can say, the aftermath of being multi-partial. You're smiling. Yes,
I was just thinking your reference on Freud and old psychoanalyst, and then I
yes,
was thinking probably if Freud was practicing the way that he practiced when he first started all this, he
yes,
would lose his license. He wouldn't practice at all.
yeah.
In today's standard, he is a really bad therapist.
Yes, yes, but again, you have to see this is exactly that. You have to see psychology through the lens of through the social, the reality
Hmm.
every time. Okay, so Freud, okay, was the foundation, but philosophy again, etc. But if you see it, uh, if you try to see it in parallel with the development of art, of cinema, of theater, okay, you will see, parallel processes. You will see in the dawning of theater the method acting, right? We have written a book about the uh, ultra conscious self. That what its term I think by Chekhov, for example. So they discuss about being uh, super conscious, right?
Hmm.
And who am I on stage? So you can start from method acting, and then, for example, with Stella Adler, they went to the more social aspect of theater, and now they are in the here and now. of the theater. Okay, so it's in parallels. I think these are different languages, if I may say. But that's another discussion, and I will not dive into it. Just a reference.
It's a really intriguing idea, and it's a concept where, in a way, art also becomes a therapeutic process because it's a way of telling story, way of rewriting a narrative story.
Exactly.
And all, f- I assume, for a person to become this process for art, like let's take the theater, to be transformative, all they need to do is relate.
Exactly. So here you have a projective identity, right?
Uh-huh. Okay.
In art. And we use very much, we use art tools in therapy, of course. You can use phototherapy, cinema therapy, projective, images, etc. So basically, yes, you have a collective unconscious, right? You have the archetypes, and you have to, find the archetypes in the stories again. So again, we can go back to this intergenerational aspect that we discussed. Um, And what I really like is what I think Oliver Sacks discusses it. He says that we are, at the same time, we are the directors of our film,
Mm-hmm.
okay? And at the same time, any given moment, every frame, okay, we are the protagonist, okay? So if you see your clients in that way, or the therapist, okay, that as we do in classes, you have to be in three places at the same time. You have to be again in a reflective manner, right? You have to be uh, the client, to be the therapist, you have to be the observant. Okay, as Anderson says, participant observer, right? So you have to be in a lot of different places at the same time. And all these voices, I think, sometime, because it's a work in progress, they will gradually, blend in a beautiful, harmony, like a chorus or something.
Especially with the narrative story, something you said, let's not overlook it. You just said we project self and identities and we see our own narrative stories in art in other people's life. And you even
Mm-hmm.
went further and saying Jung was saying that these stories that we are attracted to are not just something that is related with us. It's a notion. There is a Mayan, meta story that travels through time and
Exactly,
shapes
exactly,
us.
exactly, exactly. It's the way you relate to these stories again, because when we work in cinema therapy, for example,
Mm.
uh, you may observe the way an adolescent, for example, relates to the character, relates to the okay identification, etc. So it's a very useful tool, yes, in therapy as well. Um, yeah, and phototherapy again. I always invite children and adolescents to take photographs. So if you cannot tell this, there are a lot of different ways to tell a story, right? Someone may be writing it down. Someone may be record it. Someone may put it in pictures, right?
Mhm.
So whatever is the narrative, uh, this is what you dive into as a narrative therapist, and you may be called as an assistant autobiographer if it helps, right? Yeah.
I know what you mean. I ask my clients a lot to watch movies
Hmm.
and we discuss movies because I think it is a bit easier to talk about what we see and how we experience
Exactly.
a story, and then rather than talking our own pain out in open, what you said is being vulnerable. So it's a way of being vulnerable without actually, being vulnerable, just talking
Voluntary.
about the
Exactly.
story, talking
Exactly.
about
Exactly.
something. And also it is sometimes my clients comes and says, I don't remember anything. And I ask them, they have pictures from childhood,
Mm.
and then
Yes.
they
Oh my
act
God.
as anchors,
Anchored. Yes.
and then they just brings all these memories and emotions and all these stories that needs to be retold and reprocessed, and
Yes. Exactly.
it becomes a
Anchors of
transformative
meaning,
experience.
right? Yeah.
Yes, anchors
Oh,
of meaning.
nice. Nice.
Mm,
Uh, nice image. I'm creating images as you speak. It's a very nice image, that one. Anchors of meaning. Yeah.
mm. And I think there's also I I, I attended a workshop about psychodrama,
Yes. Exactly. Exactly.
and it was quite intriguing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And perhaps the process changes and takes many shapes. We just learn to recognize it.
I think the main element of psychodrama is the embodiment of self, because
Mm,
I really like that we're bringing into the discussion the embodied self, right?
mhm.
Because we're basically, having an experience, okay, through our bodies. Um, so the first thing we have to do as, when we train as therapists is exactly that, train this embodied self, okay, to be, more empathetic, or more, competent, or more, this is the vessel, okay, the therapeutic vessel.
Mhm.
Exactly.
Okay.
Um, and self-compassion, again, self-compassion, because we talked about resilience. Self-compassion is everything. Okay, when you have to be empathetic, all day long, self-compassion is a very, very key element. And I think self-compassion is a conversation to our, core self, with our core self, right? Yeah.
You're working a lot with children.
Yes.
I'm really curious. How does play
Ha. Yes.
acts in this, especially forming self with the children?
Again, yes. Thank you for this question. Again, in childhood we have these, uh, self monologues, right?
Mhm.
So at first they are, externalized without shame, and this is part of the symbolic, act of, of play, etc. Then, okay, we are. This is the social demand that we internalize this dialogue, right? So
Hmm.
this is internalized dialogue. So again, the therapist has to be in collaboration with this internal dialogical self. Okay. In play therapy, basically what we do is watch this internal dialogue of the child, okay, manifest and flourish, and give space to all different voices to be heard, right? So if they tell me that they have an imaginary friend, for example, I invite them in the to join, right?
Hmm.
Uh, so yeah, basically that. Um, you can see a lot of, through projective tests, through projective images, you can see a lot of different voices, arising. So that's basically what we do in play therapy, uh, through the symbolic act. This is difficult when you do not have the symbolic, um, functionality. Okay, especially when we work with children on the autism spectrum, the symbolic representation is very, weak, and you have to build on that again. But it's very, children are wise, right? Because they are talking about the sense of self, because we did some kind of, qualitative research, in a lot of different, mind-blowing ways. So the inner self as a compass, for example, or the dark self, or the bright self, the funny self, you know, the normal self,
So
the
what you're saying
serious
is
self.
play is
Yeah,
children learning to become vulnerable,
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
and perhaps stopping that play kind of forces us to transform into something not vulnerable, something that is protective.
Yeah.
Hmm. I don't think
Social, social interpretations, right? Yes, you
of
have
course,
to be this,
obviously.
have to be that. Okay, you cannot be yourself, at school. Please try to be less of yourself, right? These are all the wrong, non-functional, uh, manifestations, language manifestations that may lead the child to anxiety or, uh, not speaking, diagnostically, but in a sense of depression because they are not accepted, right? As they are. I cannot be myself, right? This is a very common thing.
What we're Our conversation is immensely intriguing for me, and
Well,
if
yes.
if we have
I think we're,
time,
yeah,
and
that's a lot of, yeah.
if we have time, I want to just keep going, but I know that we have a time limit, and perhaps what we could do, that I would love to talk to you again, and maybe we can go in detail on some of the
Yes,
topics that we talk about, or possibly we might find something else and something new to talk about it as well.
surely. Yes, I would be glad, yes. It would be a joy.
Thank
Uh,
you. Thank you for joining, and thank you for sharing all this journey about self with me.
I hope this was helpful, and at some point, bringing some new light to some concepts. Yeah,
Um, for our students at the New York College Athens and all our listeners from Spotify and YouTube, thank you for being with us, and we will be back.
sure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us.